Welcome back. This is Definitive Fabrication. My name's Scott, and this is the third installment of the Dusty Bird project. Now, in the last episode, we got the chassis jig all set up and leveled and in position so we could get the car in place. I went ahead and taken the liberty of working ahead a little bit and want to show you what I got done. We're currently looking from a position where the left rear tire would be, and we're looking at the 4-link mounts. And what I did was I created a small fixture out of a piece of angle iron and some brackets that I cut out on the CNC plasma table to get the chassis height correct here in the rear. And I spoke to the manufacturers of this, who originally built this chassis, and although they couldn't tell me the exact ride height that it was built for, because of the nature of how it was built, they thought it was somewhere between 6 and 8 inches. And so what we've done is we've set this up to get the chassis at a 7-inch ride height to the bottom of this rear tube. So we've got that in place. Let me show you what we did in the front. So we've done something similar here in the front. Because we are removing the front clip, we can't go as far forward as we would like to. But what I've done, I've cut this cross member right here with a couple saddles that are welded to a piece of 2-inch square tubing to replicate the correct ride height at the front. In this position, what we determined was that the rocker bars, and let me get you a shot. The rocker bars are right here, and those rocker bars are now horizontal. You can see on the other side. Now, the body isn't permanently tied to this chassis yet. In fact, we'll be cutting it loose here in just a little bit to make room to remove the old material on the front clip. So any adjustments that need to be made later on can be done so quite easily. But this should get the chassis at the correct ride height. So now the question is, how do we get the chassis square to the chassis jig? So let me show you what I've done. So now we're at the front of the chassis jig looking towards the car, and what I did was I made these brackets, and this is something that could be permanently affixed to the chassis jig, but if you ever didn't need it, it would be in the road. So what I typically do is something of this nature that can be removed after the project's over. Now what we've done is clamp this, and this will stay in place for the duration of this project. And what I've done is cut out a couple of brackets with a V that a string line can rest in, and we've pulled a string, and on each end of the jig we have centered that string in the jig. Now the accuracy of that is not nearly as important as you would think, although we're going to do as good as we can, because since these brackets will not be removed, we can remove this string, let's say if it's in the road or something of that nature, and then we can return that string to the same position and use it to measure off of. So this will be the master center line for the duration of this project. So let's go back. Let's go take a look at the back. So here we are at the back, looking forward as if you were in the driver's seat of the car. And we've done something similar. The same bracket that we used on the front, we've now used back here. It is clamped in place. It is centered between the rails of the chassis jig, and this will remain in place as long as the project is ongoing until the car comes off the jig. And like I said, there is no, let me back you up a little bit. All I've got is a roll of string, and as you can see right there, it loosened up so that if something happens and I hit this string, it's not tied tight to anything. I can put some tension in it, and if we bump this somewhere up front while we're working on the car. We're not going to pull anything loose or anything of that nature. If we need to remove this string, if it's in our road, it's easy to do, and we'll be able to put it right back in place. Now let me show you what this plumb bob is all about. If you were building a car like this brand new, what you would do is you would fixture the rear end up centered on the jig, and then you would fixture the struts at the correct wheelbase, at the correct track, and you'd place the engine where you want it, and then you'd build everything, you know, from the motor plates out, from the struts in, and build the car that way. Now, since we're kind of going a little bit in reverse on this project, what we have to do is figure out where the center line of this chassis is. And the important parts are the forelink, where the forelink is at, because you don't want that to be offset. You want to start from square. The problem with that is because there's not much farther forward of that to measure from, it leads to some inaccuracies. So rather than start the center line, start putting this car on the center of the jig based upon the forelink mounts, what I've done is I came back to this rear tube and measured the center, and there's a line here, but you can't see it because it's directly under this string, and I've dropped a plumb bob. Put this piece of tape on there just to add a little insurance so that it doesn't move around, and we've shifted the car from side to side to get the center line of this tube directly over that string line. And I think you can see that we're in a pretty good position right there. So let's go look and see what we did at the front to get, because that just takes the back of the car and gets the back of the car centered. Let's go look at what we did in the front. Okay, we're now looking from a position where if there was a passenger seat in this car looking forward and down. The problem with trying to center the front half of this chassis up is that it's not necessarily symmetrical. These inner chassis rails right here, I don't trust those to be symmetrical because, well, if you look at these upper rails, on the driver's side, it's not the same shape as it is on the passenger side. And some of that has to do with foot clearance and things of that nature. But either way, I don't trust those inner rails to be necessarily symmetrical over the center line of the way this chassis was built. So, looking at the chassis, you got to say, well, you know, what is symmetrical? What is the same distance from the center line? And so, what I came up with is these A-pillar bars on each side. I think it's reasonable to believe that these are the same distance from the center line of the chassis. Now, the problem with measuring these is because they are on an angle, where do you measure from? A better position maybe to measure from would be these rocker bars, the forward position, and go clear to the outside and measure to the center. But that has its own challenges, and I won't go into that. So what I've done is I've taken this piece of some type of unistrut, and I've laid it on top of the chassis rails and brought it down so that it rests, this edge rests on the front of these A-pillar bars. And then I've measured to the best of my ability from the inside of these A-pillar bars to find a center line that is, of course, equal distance from the insides of these rails. And then done the same as we did on the back and dropped a plumb bob and then adjusted the chassis side to side to get that centered up. Let's go forward and take a look at that, where that plumb bob's at. Okay, here's a little better shot of where that plumb bob's at, and I'll leave that piece of unistrut clamped to the chassis for the duration of the project until this thing gets back down on the ground, or at least until the front end, all the tube is mocked up and tacked in place to where it can no longer move. Let's move back to the forelink and take another look at a second check that I did. Okay, so now you're just about dead center, maybe slightly right, looking forward on the car underneath of where the differential would be. And what I did, because really it doesn't matter where that rear tube is positioned. It could be left or right, and you know, that's not going to affect, you know, because the working part of the car is from this four-link and the shock mounts forward to all that. So it's important that these four-link mounts are centered in the car, or that we treat that as center. So just to back check to what I've done is I took a square and dropped off of this angle iron and bumped up against the string line and made a mark. Did the same thing as the other side. So what is right dead center between those two marks should be the center line of the chassis. So I moved my square and put it this leading edge dead center between those marks, and measured from the same point on the left four-link mount to this edge of the square, and the same from over there, and came up with, I'm not going to say I'm dead center, you're never going to be perfect. The difference between the left measurement and the right measurement is well within what I would consider an acceptable error. So that tells me that I've now got this chassis square on the jig, and I have clamped every point where the fixtures that's holding the chassis mount to the jig. I've clamped and actually added another clamp or two so that we can be reasonably assured, unless we bump into this thing with a forklift or a truck, that the chassis and the jig are now what we could call intimate, and are going to remain that way. Now, we can always go back and check if something happens and it gets bumped. We're going to move the body here in a little bit, and when we do, I'll definitely go back and make sure that we still have nothing has moved. You know, any major movements like that will necessitate a back check, or you know, if an accident happened and we think something might have moved. This is the benefit of using a jig over, say, doing it on a concrete floor, because it would take quite a bit to get this thing to shift or move at this point. So we're really in a good position. So the next thing we need to do before we move the body back to gain access to do the demo is we need to reference the position of the body. And let me show you how we're going to do that. Okay, so here we are. We're on the left side at the front of the driver's side rocker panel. And what I've done is I've placed a piece of tape on that rocker panel on that leading edge, and I've made a mark at that corner to indicate where that leading edge is. Because what we've done is the owner has found an existing car, and this is going to be a stock wheelbase car. It's not going to have an extended nose or anything of that nature. It'll have stock fenders and all that. So what he has done is he has taken measurements from that leading edge of the rocker, and here in this portion we're actually looking from the passenger side. But he measured the center line of the front wheel to that leading edge of the rocker that I've marked here at 26¼ inches. And that's the dimension we'll use to position the strut jigs. So what we need to do before this body comes off of here is transfer this position to the chassis jig. And what will be interesting is if this position on this side of the car is the same as that position on the other side of the car. If you do much of this work with stock bodies, you'll find that the factory isn't nearly as accurate as you would like to think that they probably would be. You'll find that there's a really good chance that this point on this side of the car could easily be off, say, 1/4 inch from the other side of the car. But what we do in that case is we just split the difference, and 1/8 inch difference in wheelbase or front wheel position is not going to break the bank. So, but either way, and you know, you could just measure this from one side and go from there. But we'll check it from both sides. And I'm going to do that off camera. So probably the next thing you're going to see is I got a buddy stopping over this afternoon, and we're going to knock this body loose and pick it up and move it back about 12 inches, I think, is the plan. So we'll see how that goes. I don't know if you can help or not, Greg. It's kind of a two-guy deal here. I think that this may have to spread this out just a little bit, but maybe not. I think we just go up high enough to get it off that mount over there. It's obviously going to have to tilt up a little bit because this here is going to hit right here. But as long as we get it back behind this point right here, then that'll do me. That makes sense?
Well, we're on top of that. Ready?
Yep. We're on the glass, ain't we? Hey, Greg, grab that stand right there and run it back there and put it underneath the back of the body. We'll have to lift it up and we'll have to support the back of the body.
All right. Pick it up.
Pick it up.
Pick the stand up.
It should just pick straight up. Shake it bracketly.
Okay.
We're still in the glass, ain't we?
Yep. Move more towards the rear.
Now pick that stand up. Ready? Okay. How will that? Does that look like a hole?
Will I do it?
Yeah.
Hey, this bar's not well in here.
All right, so that wasn't fun at all. It's only 94 degrees here today, but I thought I'd go ahead and give you a shot of what it looks like when we're cut back to fresh material. Here's the passenger side, and that frame horn on this side, I don't know if we noted it before or not, but it goes back a little further than what the driver's side did, so we'll have to do something a little different on this side, but we'll get into that into a later episode. Anyway, hey, listen, thanks for watching. Hit a thumbs up if you don't mind, and I'll see you on the next episode, and we'll start putting this thing back together.